In the sprawling, manicured landscape of Beverly Hills, California, perfection is not just a goal. It is a requirement. North Elm Drive is a street lined with multi-million-dollar mansions, towering palm trees, and the silent hum of immense wealth. It is a place where privacy is guarded as fiercely as a bank vault, and where the problems of the outside world, violence, poverty, desperation, seem like distant fictions. But on the night of August 20th, 1989, that illusion of safety was shattered, not by an intruder from the outside, but from within the very heart of a family that seemed to have it all. The story of the Menendez brothers is one that has captivated the world for decades. It is a narrative that weaves together the darkest threads of the human experience. Immense privilege, alleged abuse, psychological trauma, and a crime so shocking it redefined the way the public consumes true crime. To understand what happened that night and the labyrinthine legal battle that followed, we must look past the sensational headlines and examine the forensic facts, the psychological profiles, and the intricate judicial procedures that ultimately sealed the fate of Lyle and Erik Menendez. The evening of August 20th began like any other Sunday for the Menendez family. Jose Menendez, a Cuban-American executive who had risen from nothing to become a powerhouse in the entertainment industry, and his wife Kitty, a former beauty queen, were at home. They were watching television in the den of their Mediterranean-style mansion. Their two adult sons, 21-year-old Lyle and 18-year-old Erik, had gone out for the evening. Or so it seemed. At 11:47 p.m., the Beverly Hills Police Department received a frantic 911 call. The voice on the other end was hysterical. It was Lyle Menendez. He screamed that someone had killed his parents. When police arrived at the scene, they walked into a nightmare. Jose and Kitty Menendez had been subjected to a barrage of gunfire from 12-gauge shotguns. The nature of the attack was overwhelming, suggesting an intensity of rage or a desire to ensure absolute finality. The initial investigation was complicated by the sheer status of the victims. Jose Menendez was a man with connections, but also a man with enemies. In the high-stakes world of corporate entertainment, he was known for his aggressive business tactics. Early speculation by law enforcement focused on a potential mob hit. The method of the killing, a sudden, overwhelming ambush, seemed professional, or at least intended to look that way. Detectives looked into Jose's business dealings, investigating whether a disgruntled associate or organized crime syndicate had ordered the execution. For weeks, the brothers were not considered prime suspects. They played the part of grieving orphans. They wept at the memorial service. They accepted the condolences of the community. However, subtle cracks began to appear in the facade, visible only to those paying the closest attention. The first red flag was not forensic, but behavioral. In the immediate aftermath of a tragedy, psychology tells us that grief manifests in many ways. But the behavior of Lyle and Erik raised eyebrows among the detectives assigned to the case. Within days of their parents' deaths, the brothers began spending money at an alarming rate. They did not save, they did not mourn in seclusion, they consumed. They purchased 3 Rolex watches. They bought a Porsche. They hired a full-time tennis coach. They invested in a restaurant. In total, it is estimated they spent nearly $700,000 in a span of 6 months. To the investigators, this did not look like grief. It looked like a celebration. It looked like the behavior of 2 young men who had suddenly come into a fortune and were eager to enjoy it. This spending spree shifted the focus of the investigation. The mob hit theory began to lose traction as no credible threats against Jose emerged from his business life. The police began to look inward. They started to piece together a timeline that contradicted the brothers' alibis. But they needed more than circumstantial evidence of greed. They needed a smoking gun. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, introducing a complex legal debate regarding patient-therapist privilege that is still studied in law schools today. Erik Menendez, the younger and reportedly more fragile of the two, had been seeing a psychologist named Dr. Jerome Oziel. In October 1989, 2 months after the murders, Erik called Dr. Oziel, distraught. During a session, and later in sessions involving Lyle, the brothers confessed to the killings. Dr. Oziel, fearing for his own safety and unsure of his legal standing, recorded these sessions. The existence of these tapes might have remained a secret, protected by doctor-patient confidentiality, if not for a woman named Judalon Smith. Smith was Dr. Oziel's mistress, and after a falling out with the therapist, she went to the police. She informed them of the tape's existence. This triggered a fierce legal battle. The defense argued that the tapes were inadmissible, protected by the sanctity of the therapist's office. The prosecution argued that the crime-fraud exception applied, meaning that privilege does not apply if the patient is using the therapist to further a crime or cover it up, or if the therapist is threatened. After a prolonged legal tug-of-war, a judge ruled that the tapes were admissible. On March 8, 1990, Lyle was arrested. Erik surrendered days later upon returning from a tennis tournament in Israel. The grieving orphans were now the accused. The first trial, which began in 1993, became a national phenomenon. It was broadcast on court TV, marking the beginning of the era of televised trials that turned legal proceedings into daily entertainment. But beyond the cameras, the courtroom became a battleground for two competing narratives: greed versus fear. The prosecution, led by a tenacious team, presented a straightforward case. They argued that Lyle and Erik were spoiled, sociopathic rich kids who killed their parents to get their hands on the $14 million estate. They pointed to the spending spree. They pointed to the purchase of the shotguns days before the murder, which the brothers had used fake identification to buy. They pointed to the fact that the brothers had tried to create an alibi by buying movie tickets. To the state, this was first-degree murder, calculated and cold. The defense, led by the formidable Leslie Abramson, presented a narrative that shocked the public. They did not deny that the brothers killed their parents. Instead, they argued that the killings were an act of self-preservation. This was the imperfect self-defense theory. The defense claimed that for their entire lives, Lyle and Erik had been victims of severe chronic abuse at the hands of their father, while their mother, Kitty, enabled the behavior and suffered from her own substance abuse and mental health struggles. Abramson painted a picture of the Menendez household that was a house of horrors hidden behind a velvet curtain. She detailed allegations of controlling behavior, immense psychological pressure, and physical violations. The defense argued that on the night of the killings, the brothers genuinely believed their parents were about to kill them to silence them. They argued that the fear was real to the brothers, even if an objective observer might not have seen an immediate threat. In legal terms, imperfect self-defense can reduce a charge from murder to manslaughter. The jury was presented with a difficult task: reconcile the brutal nature of the crime with the horrific testimony of the brothers' upbringing. The trial lasted months. When it finally went to the jury, the result was chaos. Because the brothers were tried together but had separate juries, the deliberation process was complex. In the end, both juries deadlocked. They could not agree on whether the brothers were cold-blooded killers or victims acting out of terror. The result was a mistrial. The deadlock stunned the prosecution. They had underestimated the power of the abuse narrative. For the second trial, which began in 1995, the strategy changed significantly. The judge ruled that cameras would not be allowed in the courtroom, changing the atmosphere entirely. More importantly, the judge severely limited the amount of testimony allowed regarding the abuse allegations. The court ruled that much of the background information was irrelevant to the specific moment of the crime. Stripped of the emotional context that had swayed the first juries, the defense was hobbled. The second trial focused strictly on the mechanics of the murder: the planning, the purchase of the weapons, the execution, and the cover-up. The prosecution hammered home the timeline. they emphasized the reload. Evidence showed that after the initial volley of gunfire, the brothers had gone out to their car to reload their weapons before returning to deliver the final fatal shots. This act, the prosecution argued, proved premeditation and malice, negating any claim of a panic-induced reaction. In 1996, the verdict was returned. Lyle and Erik Menendez were found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The jury rejected the theories of manslaughter or self-defense. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For decades, that seemed to be the end of the story. The brothers were separated, sent to different maximum security prisons, and the world moved on. They became cautionary tales about the corrupting influence of wealth. However, the justice system and public opinion are rarely static. As the years turned into decades, a cultural shift occurred. In the 2020s, a new generation discovered the Menendez case, largely through social media platforms and true crime documentaries. This re-examination was not just a trend, it coincided with a broader societal understanding of trauma and abuse, particularly male victims of abuse. Viewers began to look at the testimony from the 1993 trial with fresh eyes. Furthermore, new evidence began to surface. A letter, allegedly written by Erik to his cousin months before the murders, was discovered. In it, Erik describes the fear and the abuse he was suffering at home. This letter, had it been available in 1996, could have corroborated the defense's claims of long-term fear, potentially altering the verdict. Additionally, a former member of a boy band came forward with allegations against Jose Menendez, claiming he too had been victimized by the executive in the 1980s. This external testimony lent credibility to the brothers' claims that their father was a predator. This resurgence of interest and new evidence has led to new legal filings. The question now facing the legal system is whether this new information is sufficient to warrant a new trial or a resentencing. It challenges the rigidity of the law. If the brothers were indeed victims of the abuse they described, does that excuse the murder? No, but does it change the definition of the crime from cold-blooded murder to a tragic reaction to trauma? That is the question of manslaughter versus murder, and the difference is the difference between a life sentence and freedom. From a forensic standpoint, the case remains a masterclass in crime scene analysis and error. The initial failure to secure the house allowed for contamination, but the hard evidence, the gun purchase records, the ballistics, was irrefutable. The case serves as a grim reminder that forensic science can tell us how a crime happened, but it cannot always tell us why. The why resides in the complex, often invisible psychology of the human mind. The legacy of the Menendez brothers case is multifaceted. It changed the way trials are consumed by the public. It sparked conversations about the hidden nature of familial abuse in wealthy communities. And it continues to pose difficult questions about the nature of justice. Is justice simply the application of the law to the facts, or must it encompass the totality of the human experience, including the invisible scars of trauma? As Lyle and Erik Menendez remain incarcerated, now reunited in the same facility, their story serves as a somber reflection on the destruction of a family. 4 lives were effectively ended that night in Beverly Hills, 2 by gunfire and 2 by the prison bars that would follow. We are left to wonder, if the trial were held today, with our modern understanding of psychology and the new evidence at hand, would the verdict be the same? Does the passage of time change the truth, or does it simply change our ability to see it? Ultimately, the tragedy of North Elm Drive is a story with no winners. It is a narrative of loss, a study in the breakdown of the most fundamental human bond, that between parent and child. It reminds us that behind the highest gates and the most expensive doors, the truth can be more complicated and more tragic than we could ever imagine.